Donald Trump just gave a disastrous speech at the West Point U.S. Army graduation. Donald Trump left the audience stunned. First and foremost, Donald Trump seemed that he didn't even know how to get to the microphone, and he had to be escorted because he seemed like he didn't even know where he was.
Donald Trump had what could only be described as a disastrous Sunday, starting with his West Point speech that left people cringing and ending with bizarre posts about a golf course Swan. But that's not even the half of it. What happened in between will leave you either laughing, shocked, or shaking your head. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great. Thank you so much. Now, back to the video. What went wrong during Trump's speech at West Point?
Donald Trump talks to the West Point Army graduates about a friend of his who had a trophy wife, and the audience is just absolutely stunned. Silence.
Found a new wife. He sold his little boat and he got a big yacht. He had one of the biggest yachts anywhere in the world. He moved for a time to Monte Carlo and he led the good life.
Ranting about trophy wives and second wives and his billionaire friends. It got even weirder than that, folks. Donald Trump then used this speech to attack the transgender members.
Honestly, it might be quicker to list what didn't. The stage was set for a moment that should have been presidential. Rows of graduates in crisp uniforms, families watching with pride, and all eyes on Trump as he addressed the future officers of the US military. Now, giving a commencement speech at such a prestigious military academy isn't just about handing out diplomas. It's one of those rare moments where a political leader, let alone a former president, gets a chance to not just deliver a message, but inspire. Yet somehow, Trump managed to turn this solemn occasion into a showcase of awkwardness. Before he even opened his mouth, something was off. As Trump arrived on stage, he greeted the crowd with a wave that felt more like he was swatting away flies. And while most speakers at West Point come ready to shake hands with the graduates they've congratulated, Trump skipped that tradition entirely. Not a high five, not a handshake, nothing. It was as if he were allergic to human connection, leaving many in the audience shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Not exactly the warm, heartfelt moment you expect to see at a commencement ceremony. Then he started speaking, and it didn't get better. Trump's delivery wasn't fiery or commanding. It wasn't even remotely engaging. In fact, he sounded like he was reading a sleep-inducing script that he'd just seen 5 minutes earlier.
They have to have common sense, and we've liberated our troops from divisive and demeaning political trainings.
Talking about men playing women's sports. That was a major part of what he was talking about. Again, just trying to create divisions in our country and using the army as props. Despicable.
There will be no more critical race theory or transgender for everybody forced onto our brave men and women in uniform or on anybody else for that matter in this country.
The enthusiasm level? Somewhere between DMV worker and grocery store self-checkout machine. At one point, it wouldn't have been surprising if someone in the crowd had started snoring. He rambled at times, threw out a few awkward attempts at humor, and even managed to mispronounce words. A classic Trump move. But when you're addressing Service Academy graduates, traditionally a no-nonsense and proud crowd, that lack of focus sticks out like a bad haircut at a military inspection. Here's where it gets even more cringeworthy. Take, for example, past West Point speeches. Presidents like Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and even Ronald Reagan brought a sense of gravitas. They painted pictures of unity and patriotism, discussed the challenges ahead, and left the graduates feeling ready to take on the world. Contrast that with Trump, who, as one attendee put it, delivered a speech that felt more like a bad Twitter thread than a commencement address. His words didn't soar, they barely got off the ground, and as he fumbled through his remarks, you could almost feel secondhand embarrassment ripple through the audience like waves on a particularly awkward ocean. The lack of connection didn't go unnoticed either. Several graduates reportedly exchanged puzzled glances as if wondering, is this really happening? There was polite applause at the end, but it was the kind of forced clapping people do when it's clear that the thing they're clapping for is painfully subpar.
Not even more despicable from there. He started to attack former President Obama and was lying and saying that we used to have hypersonic weapons, as Donald Trump basically did no sanctions against Putin, and Trump gave up on negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Donald Trump is speaking before the United States Army, attacking a former commander-in-chief and defaming him.
You know, we had ours stolen. We are the designer of it. We had it stolen during the Obama administration. We stole it.
Remember when Bill Clinton famously wowed audiences with his blend of Southern charm and intelligence during public speeches? Well, Trump's performance at West Point was like the bad cover band version of that. Commentators were quick to point out just how underwhelming it was. One wrote, "This wasn't just bad, it was bizarre." It lacked any sense of inspiration or leadership, which is the bare minimum for these types of events. Some even speculated whether Trump's priority wasn't the event or the graduates at all. It was about trying to boost his own image after a series of rough weeks. If that's true, let's just say, mission not accomplished. And the online backlash, oh, it was brutal. Social media lit up as clips of the awkward speech started circulating, with everything from memes labeling it Sleepy Don at it again, to users joking that even AI speech bots could have done a better job.
Donald Trump speaks to the United States Army grads, the West Point grads, about how he took a trip to Qatar where he got an airplane for $400 million, which he thinks is good for America, even though it's a gift for himself.
The United States of America is hotter now than we've ever seen it, and a year ago it was as cold as it gets, and it's true. It's true.
So he wanted the United States military, he wanted our army and the grads at West Point to know that Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia thinks that we are hot.
Twitter naturally was having a field day, with hashtags like #TrumpFails taking off faster than his speech ever did. But what really sealed the disaster was the news coverage. Major outlets didn't hesitate to criticize what many called one of Trump's worst public appearances since leaving office. Headlines ranged from flat and forlorn at West Point to Trump misses the mark again. Even conservative commentators, usually quick to defend him, were noticeably silent, or worse, critical. It was clear that many viewed this speech as less about the graduates and more about Trump. Once again, he seemed to turn an apolitical event into a strange reflection of his own inability to read the room. As the backlash started to pile up, you might have guessed Trump would take a moment to retreat, reflect, maybe even recover, but no. In typical Trump fashion, he took a hard pivot to try and draw attention elsewhere. Enter the golf course and the infamous Swan post, which, believe it or not, made the West Point speech feel almost normal in comparison. After tanking so spectacularly at West Point, you'd think Trump might just step back and call it a day. But no, instead he fled to the one place where he seems to think he's untouchable, his Bedminster Golf Club in New Jersey. Golf has been Trump's go-to coping mechanism for years. Lost an election, play 18 holes, got impeached, time for golf. Couldn't finish a speech without people laughing at you? Well, you guessed it. Get the clubs out. But this time, his usual retreat took an extra weird turn. Somewhere between bunkers and birdies, Trump decided that what the world really needed wasn't an explanation for his latest failure, but a swan photo. That's right, Trump posted a picture of a swan on his golf course with the caption, "I always said golf can be a dangerous sport, my friend being bit at Bedminster." First off, let's break this down. A swan on a golf course biting someone. And Trump thought this was the perfect story to post while the whole internet roasted his West Point disaster. If his plan was to distract, this was one of the oddest attempts in political history. Either that or Trump believes that golf swan attacks are a bigger headline than his own bombed speech. And honestly, with the way his brain works, it's kind of hard to tell which one he thought people would care about more. Now, let's talk about this Swan post, because the layers of absurdity deserve their own analysis. For starters, Trump has a habit of using random stunts on social media. Every time something disastrous happens to him, it's like his version of throwing a shiny object in the air to keep people from noticing the fire burning behind him. But a swan biting someone? That's less shiny distraction and more, what are you even doing right now? It's almost as if he spun a wheel labeled weird crisis distractions and landed on birds golf. Like, does anyone really believe Trump spends his time worrying about endangered animals or bird attacks? Probably not, but hey, at least that Swan got its 15 minutes of fame. Social media reaction, of course, was relentless. The internet wasted no time tearing into the post. People jumped in with memes, jokes, and mock captions. One Twitter user asked, "Is the Swan now running his PR? Because this is about as effective as everything else Trump's tried this weekend." Another joked, "Swans are rejecting Trump just like the American voters did." And let's not ignore the fact that while Trump tried to shift focus with some bird drama, it just made his critics zero in harder on his failures. The Swan didn't save him, it just gave people a new punchline. This is the thing with Trump's social media distractions. What used to work earlier in his career is just flat out backfiring now. There was a time when his posts, as chaotic as they were, could actually dominate an entire news cycle. Whether it was mocking someone, spreading false claims, or simply screaming in all caps, it somehow got the job done. But now, it's mostly crickets or ridicule. The Swan saga only highlighted how disconnected and desperate his methods have become. Sure, Team Trump might have hoped this goofy post would have people talking about golf rather than his failed speech, but the reality is, it just made him look even more out of touch. And let's not ignore the historical pattern here. Trump's been doing this distraction routine forever. Whenever he's gotten into trouble, whether it's a controversy, a bad poll, or just generally being bad at, well, everything, he pulls some ridiculous stunt on social media. We've seen everything from bizarre tweets to random photo ops, all designed to shift attention away from his gaffes. Unfortunately for him, people are catching on to the trick. The Swan incident, rather than helping him change the conversation, ended up being yet another example of how predictable he's become. To make things worse, the timing of the post couldn't have been more off. By midday, the West Point backlash had already grown. Dozens of media outlets were analyzing his dead-eyed performance, and even supporters were left scratching their heads. So instead of facing it head-on, which was never his strong suit to begin with, Trump decided to shoehorn a Swan photo into the mix. If anything, it only painted a bigger picture of desperation. A former president under fire for fumbling yet another public appearance was now clinging to a tale about Swans biting golfers. You almost have to admire the absurd commitment here. As the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that the Swan post wasn't going to save him. Instead, people started digging even deeper into his growing unpopularity and questionable tactics. Critics pointed out that Trump's distractions don't land like they used to, mainly because they've stopped surprising people. Another user tweeted, "Trump distracting us with a swan? The man is officially out of material. It's like the magician who pulls rabbits out of a hat, only for the audience to yawn because they've seen that trick 1,000 times. Whatever message he hoped to send, it certainly wasn't received." And as if the pressure from the West Point fiasco and the ridiculous Swan photo weren't enough, the ripples of the day were starting to touch everything else. Social media mockery turned into serious discussions about Trump's unraveling strategy, both personally and politically. Financial questions began bubbling up too, but we'll get to that in a moment. The truth is, the Swan post wasn't just a flop, it was symbolic of a larger issue. Trump's old bag of tricks just isn't cutting it anymore. In fact, it's starting to backfire on him in ways that even a golfer biting Swan couldn't have seen coming. But that wasn't the only thing spiraling that day. If you thought the Swan post was bizarre, wait until you hear about the Memecoin drama that followed. Let's say Trump's Sunday wasn't just filled with fake distractions, it was loaded with real problems too. Trump's Sunday wasn't just embarrassing, it was chaotic. After the West Point flop and the Swan debacle, he pivoted to something even stranger, attacking Harvard University and promoting a shady Memecoin event. Because naturally, when the world's laughing at you, the best solution is to double down on chaos. Let's start with Harvard. In a series of rambling social media posts, Trump zeroed in on the Ivy League school, accusing it of all kinds of foul behavior about, of all things, foreign students. According to Trump, Harvard isn't doing enough to disclose the names of these students, some of whom he ominously hinted come from countries that don't like us very much. If that wasn't enough, he threw in a rant about Harvard's massive endowment, around $52 billion, claiming they shouldn't be relying on federal funding at all. Now, whether Trump actually understands where Harvard's money goes or if he just Googled biggest college piggy banks in America at 2 a.m., we'll never know. But the irony here is hard to miss. This is the same man infamous for avoiding transparency about, well, anything related to his own finances. From his refusal to release tax returns to years of questionable deals, Trump attacking Harvard over its money felt like the pot calling the kettle shady. Critics were quick to point this out online. Many wondered why Trump, who's personally benefited from foreign investment throughout his career, including some shady international financing that would make a soap opera look tame, suddenly cares about transparency. It's also unclear what his endgame here was. Was he really expecting big headlines like Trump solves Harvard's funding crisis? Or was this just another case of him needing to throw a new target into the mix to distract from his own imploding Sunday? Either way, it fell flat, with most of social media pointing out how bizarre the entire rant was. But as weird as the Harvard beef sounded, it was nothing compared to the mess that followed, the infamous Memecoin dinner. And yes, it's as sketchy as it sounds. The event, hosted by Trump with Senator JD Vance, was supposed to be a fundraiser, or maybe just a cash grab, on behalf of some random cryptocurrency Memecoin. For those who aren't familiar, imagine the Dogecoin or Pepecoin craze, but somehow even less legitimate. Attendees were lured in with promises of free flights, hotels, and even a photo op with Vice President Pence, who, fun fact, didn't even end up showing up. Now, you'd think with all those incentives, the dinner would have at least tried to look a little classy. Wrong. Reports say the food was embarrassingly bad, with only water and Trump's privately branded wine being served. And water glasses only got filled once, because apparently hydration isn't on brand for Trump. The whole scene felt like a badly organized high school fundraiser, not a political event hosted by a former president. But here's where it gets worse, the Memecoin being hyped during the event. Absolute disaster. As the evening went on, the coin's value started to nosedive, dropping anywhere between 15% and 18% almost immediately. Out of the 55,000 people holding that coin, many folks lost money that night. A few insiders, meanwhile, reportedly made a profit, and surprise, surprise, their access to Trump probably wasn't a coincidence. Guess who still came out ahead though? Trump himself, who was said to have pocketed transaction fees from the event. Because if there's one thing consistent about Trump, it's that no grift is too small, or in this case, too publicly embarrassing. The backlash was swift. Critics, investors, and even former Trump supporters called out how blatant the whole setup was. Many accused him of enriching himself at the expense of gullible supporters, some of whom likely thought buying into a Trump-endorsed meme coin was a shortcut to the American dream. Instead, it was just participation in a clumsy crypto crash. And honestly, what's more Trumpian than a get-rich-quick scheme that turns around and torches the very people it promised to help? This isn't the first time financial controversy has followed Trump, though. His presidency was littered with scandals involving self-enrichment and questionable deals, but this particular fiasco hit differently. It showcased how, even out of office, Trump continues to exploit his loyalists, whether it's through overpriced wine, golf course memberships, or apparently crypto that crashes faster than his post-speech approval numbers. Let's not forget the larger message this sends. Between attacking America's leading academic institutions and promoting a scammy Memecoin dinner, Trump didn't exactly paint a picture of confidence or leadership. What stood out was the desperation. These outbursts, whether targeted at Harvard's funding or some poorly executed crypto hustle, seemed less like strategic moves and more like a man clinging to relevance, one chaotic post and poorly planned event at a time. If his goal was to distract from his flailing image after West Point, let's just say this wasn't the way to do it. Critics aren't calling this a meltdown for nothing. It's the perfect word for a day filled with bad optics, amateurish distractions, and financial schemes that fell apart faster than a cheap knockoff brand. As the Memecoin mess continued to unfold, it wasn't just his reputation taking a hit. Investors involved in the coin's collapse started connecting the dots, calling out Trump's role in the failed venture. Meanwhile, casual observers were left wondering, is this really what political leadership looks like now? A man who once controlled the nuclear codes reduced to tweeting about swans, trashing universities, and hosting crypto-fueled dinners where no one even gets a refill on their water. But don't think Trump's bizarre Sunday ended there. As his financial antics started making headlines, he tried shifting gears again. This time, he turned to an international deal involving, you guessed it, a golf resort in Vietnam. Because nothing says stable genius like throwing more fuel on a dumpster fire while shouting about how it's not your fault. Trump's Sunday wasn't just a string of bad headlines. It was a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis. From a dead-eyed speech at West Point to financially fumbling a Memecoin stunt, it all screamed desperation. And that Swan post? Honestly, it felt like he was throwing a dart blindfolded to distract people. But here's the bigger picture. These missteps aren't just embarrassing. They show a leader whose grip on his image and maybe his influence is slipping. The question now is, how much longer can Trump juggle these distractions before the whole act comes crashing down? Stay tuned.